something that irritates me is that people act like in capitalism there are unjust hierarchies, and socialism we destroy these hierarchies. We have this weird conflation sometimes of like socialism and anarchism where all these hierarchies are gone. But in reality, like you're going to have a case where some guy might want to start like a restaurant or might want to start like a car wash or whatever, and he's actually not allowed to by the government. He would be ultimately under threat of execution, right? Because that's how police escalation works. To start a business like this would be illegal. You wouldn't be allowed to start a new business. You need to find an equal amount of coworkers that all have capital that want to go on and be equal owners with you for a car. You're not allowed to do that anymore.
One argument I've always had with these people, and this is back when I was a socialist, because back when I was a commie, one of my main arguments was that in the past you've missed a lot of stuff in your critiques of socialism, and I think it's allowed a lot of people to get away with things in the past.
Okay, like what?
So for one, you've probably heard this a lot. The Soviet Union was an awful state, but we can learn a lot from the economic side because they did a lot of stuff, good stuff with central planning, that sort of thing. And this is something that I know Richard Wolff does a lot. He also does the same thing with China, where he sort of gives a tepid criticism, and then he moves on to praise all of the cool economic aspects. And Richard Wolff even goes so far as to praise Lenin. And then he's one of the people who thinks the Bolshevik Revolution was a good thing, but then Stalin ruined it all, so it's not real socialism. So for starters, the Soviet economy and most of the European communist states, their economies were almost like a sacrificial state, where they basically killed off their peasant population to fund foreign imports of machinery from France and Germany to sort of develop an industrial society. This is one of the reasons why Russia was so easily able to pull a machinery and stuff out of East Germany when they had it under its occupation. They were just able to pull all of their stuff out, aside from the train cars, and bring it back to Russia. And it was compatible with everything because most of the stuff they had was purchased from Germany before the war. For their industrial stuff. I would liken it almost to slavery, where through like the Holodomor, where they would basically take these different geographical sectors of the Soviet Union and plan that for industrialization. They'd go through the period of collectivized farms, and then they would export whatever they were able to export from there, kill off the peasants, and then use that, use the money they had, because Russia had a huge GDP. Before 1914, at the start of the war, Russia was like the third largest European economy. This is another sort of lie people use that. But it's sort of like an excuse. And Russia was so poor, it was so dysfunctional. So that is almost an excuse for the authoritarianism. In truth, Russia was an incredibly wealthy state, and most of that was held in the hands of a sort of aristocrats, and then also this sort of not really middle class, but it was sort of like an administrator class for people who did they were basically public sector workers, but they had a huge economy. I think you mentioned market socialism a lot. Do you know the term Erzählungsdiktator dictator?
I don't know.
All right. I think this was in a crap video. So it's a compound verb. It roughly translates to the educating dictatorship. It was made by it was like a 20th century socialist who looked at the 19th century, decided, that was all messed up, and I better find a way to improve it for the future, so the 21st century will finally get it right.
Okay.
I'm sure he's rolling in his grave. So anyway, it sort of speaks to the overall worldview that a lot of socialist movements had, where you sort of, like as a liberal, you sort of get your legitimacy through consent of the people you're governing. It's through public consent. You have these base values for society, and then those sort of come together, and you through democracy and stuff, you get to make policy and then hopefully improve people's lives. For the educating dictatorship, the justification doesn't come from public consent, because they think that people already sort of want it to happen, but they don't know it yet. So there's this, through that you sort of get this a lot of conspiracies. So the whole, everybody secretly wanted Bernie to win, they just didn't know it yet because of the media, like that sort of thing. And that sort of leads to a lot of, I think, a lot of mis-authoritarianism. So when you get into things like market socialism, and a lot of people would say, well, it sounds like you just want all the benefits of capitalism, but you want to put a hammer and sickle on it to look cool. That's sort of true because they want the flexibility of sort of like a market-based system, but they want the authoritarian control that you get from a socialist government. So I think that the best critique for market socialists and stuff, if you ever deal with them in the future, is just to say, like, you don't need a quote unquote market socialist state to do this. You would just operate within a democracy and get people some investments. And if it's really if co-ops are really that good, people will do them. And I would just always ask them how they feel about multi-party democracy and if they think a capitalist party can exist.
They'd probably say no, I would imagine, right?
Well, that depends who. Like, socialism done left is pretty inconsistent on this. Where, like, as far as a year ago, he was almost a tanky. Like, he's one of those people who thought, like, we should be rationing out food through the state, like that sort of thing. And depending on who he's talking to, he will, make the argument that the people may be able to vote, for capitalists and vote us out, but I just don't ever think they ever will because we're so good. So it sort of gets to that sort of argument where maybe the people can, but they never will because we're so good.
Okay.
For other socialist critiques, I guess one thing you did miss was the sort of the whole systemic problem versus the economic problem, which I think is sort of necessary for the critique. Because a lot of these socialist movements, they are 100% sort of, there's no pluralism in there. It can't really exist. You can't have like a syndicalist and like an ANCOM sort of existing within the same state, because both of them have very particular systemic goals they want to reach. And so one of a major criticism I would say of that is you should always sort of work with this realm of political pluralism, because I think that's one major thing that liberalism and capitalism can have. You can have pluralism where you can exist within a capitalist state and have a socialist party that does policy for the workers because they have democratic support, and then you don't have to basically genocide everyone else.
Yeah.
The only problem though is these people aren't really looking for finally a good way to represent the workers and to just improve people's lives, because if you did that, like who the fuck is going to hop out into the trenches and do the revolution for them if they're living in a Danish style social democracy? Which is why you see a lot of weird either you see people like Red Charlotte, who I think you've talked to before on Prime Case. Yeah, so you sort of get into these two weird realms where we have either like the Red Charlotte types, where social democrats are all actually socialists, and I think they have this weird line where like all of the European countries are actually run by socialists, and that's how they got social democracy, and then they just happen to get ousted and replaced by neoliberals right before the economic collapse in the 80s and 90s. Just so you can blame all of that on the liberals, but the social democrats are coming back. And then the other sort of group, and I think this one is a bit bigger, is that social democracy is actually really bad because it's turning the workers away from a true revolution and away from class consciousness.
Yeah.
So I think this is sort of an argument that a lot of people made for white nationalists, that you have a time frame for your ideology. Like, you can't be a white nationalist in 30 years from now because we'll just be too mixed raced. There's also a time period for socialists, where if we get these sort of progressive policies, which aren't inherently socialist but can be done under a capitalist framework, they really have a time frame where they're still allowed to harp on about the failures of capitalism before people start to naturally tend towards more social democratic policies, and then eventually they don't have anything else to say about the economy or about society.
Gotcha.
So there's that.
These are like the three questions, and I've thought about these a lot on my own, to where I'm gonna push for answers on these. Let me see if I can find this.
I think you should be more aggressive, considering that. They're arguing for a revolution. It's itself very aggressive.
So here are I think these are the questions that I have that I never get adequate answers for from socialists. So the first one is, how do we decide which businesses are allowed to exist in a socialist society without allowing capital investment? So everybody, even these fucking market socialists, which I feel like is only popular because of Vosh, even these market socialists, how do you make new businesses in a society where you have to be a co-op? Like, that basically means that no new business is allowed to form without the consent of the government, or unless you can find enough people to go in with you on it. Like, I usually let people just like kind of get away with saying like, oh, well, maybe a bank will invest, but like, I'll probably demand a better answer to this, because I really want to know, because there has to be because the only answer that I can think of, which to me is deeply unsatisfying, is you have to have some council that basically votes on which businesses are allowed to exist and which new businesses are allowed to form.
Yeah, so I guess that would really depend on what line they go. And I'm the one who introduced Vosh to market socialism.
Oh, well, way to go. Cringe.
Yeah, well, you know what? I gave him market socialism, you gave him the website. So we're both sort of both at fault for this. Oh. It sort of depends on whether or not they're going to admit to be sort of more centrally planned, or they're going to go the market socialism route. So we do actually have an example of a market socialist society. I'm in the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. That's actually it's in the Balkans. It happens to be like right next to my homeland too, which was also a communist shithole for a while. What they did is, and I'm going to coach this with that, they were on the wrong side of 30% unemployment at some points of their economy, largely because of some systemic problems with cooperatives. But what they did is they basically had like, it's sort of like they had city councils and they had counties, and these would be given money from the government to invest. And those counties would decide to invest in local businesses if those people could basically make an argument for it. Now, what wound up happening was...
I understand real quick that this is the right answer. I want to force somebody to actually say that, because I think rhetorically, I don't think that looks good. So basically, you are unallowed, because I think that this is a big thing. Something that irritates me is that people act like in capitalism there are unjust hierarchies, and socialism we destroy these hierarchies. We get this weird conflation sometimes like socialism and anarchism, where all these hierarchies are gone. But in reality, like, you're going to have a case where some guy might want to start like a restaurant, or might want to start like a car wash or whatever, and he's actually not allowed to by the government. He would be ultimately under threat of execution, right? Because that's how police escalation works. To start a business like this would be illegal. You wouldn't be allowed to start a new business. You need to find an equal amount of coworkers that all have capital that want to go in and be equal owners with you for a car. You're not allowed to do that anymore. I want to hear a socialist actually admit that, a market socialist admit that you are not allowed to ever start a new business unless you've got like other people with equal capital ready to go in with you before. I understand that there might be some ways that they can talk about city councilship, but I just want to hear them be forced to enunciate that, because I don't think that most of them would be comfortable stating that clearly.
Right, and it also sort of depends on what kind they are, because of course, not even like, they can't even have one form of market socialism. Because I used to be a Titoist, because there's just sort of like a family background, and I found it interesting. And market socialism, at least back then, it was very new, and so nobody could really argue against it. And if you don't look at it too hardly, it doesn't look as authoritarian as the Soviet Union, even though you like fucking executed people left and right. They had prison labor detentions, and they put fucking gay people in the gulag. So there's that. But yeah, it is sort of market socialism is sort of like they're trying to simulate a market. And I think this is a lot of socialist issues. They're trying to simulate the benefits of a market, but they're doing it as inefficiently as possible. It's like they want to build a zoo, but they want all of the animals to be animatronic, and they all have to be like manually operated by workers hiding in the bushes. And so there's that. I think some of them argue that it should basically, they should just have like public banks that will freely give out capital.
Any chance you will watch Jordan Peterson's
but then I guess the argument there would be that now you have these large public institutions which are basically just handing out money, and they're not able to make cost-benefit analysis to who they're actually going to give the money to. In which case, you can just have any guy can waste as much state money as he wants, as long as he can go to a different bank and get some investment for his co-op or group. For other issues with that, there are problems with cooperatives that I think a lot of people don't. I think a lot of people don't know about them, because even the co-op guys don't actually know much about co-ops. They just hear it's like, oh, it's democratic, so it must be good. There's a few major problems. One is that depending on how you do it, if you're profit sharing, this isn't necessarily as big as a problem. So if people basically just vote on a salary for all of their positions, you don't necessarily get this problem. But if people are getting paid based off of their percentage ownership of the company, then there may be a big problem there. If you're looking to hire more people, that means your percentage share is going to have less value.
That's always the case with every single co-op though, right? Necessarily. Anytime you employ more people, you're going to be diluting your own ownership of the company, right?
Well, yeah. So you sort of, depending on how you're paid, you could be diluting your own paycheck, and you're also diluting your own democratic say, because now you're hiring more people who may vote in certain ways you don't want them to.
And you have no say in the beginning either. So let's say that I really want to open a flower shop and I only want to sell like petunias and roses or some shit. If I'm going to open that shop, I need to find enough people to not only work with me, I need to find people that think the exact same way that I do. Because if I find people and eventually they disagree with selling those types of flowers, well, if they vote me out, I'm fucked. It's a co-op. I have no ownership of my company, right?
Right. So I think the argument now is that basically you would have votes based on seniority, which is sort of, it almost gets back to the old Jim Crow union structure, where they used to keep black people out. They just have the founding members, you get to have seniority votes on it. And then there are other arguments like
pull me out of a socialist
you don't automatically get a democratic say when you start to work there. You have to work there for a few years. And the best argument for that is how are you going to stop co-ops from hiring people for like 2 years before they get a democratic say, and then just kicking them out before they're allowed to vote and do stuff. And that's why actually Mondragon and a few other co-ops do so much contract, because they don't want to give those people a democratic say in the workplace because they don't trust them enough.
Yeah.
Aside from that, and this gets more into syndicalism, because I think Vosh, he used to be a syndicalist. He used to be a lot of things. He called himself a syndicalist up until a few months ago. I don't know if he's just a market socialist now, but if he still is, this is an argument against a lot of the sort of more centrally planned aspects. Now, in syndicalism, you have these sort of different, basically trade unions that span across the economy, and they all have to basically have their own representatives and come together in sort of like a parliament for syndicates and stuff. But there's an argument broadly against centrally planned stuff. Is that if you actually really want to give workers a say in the means of production, you can't plan it out. Because even if they're voting on a representative who votes on a representative who votes on an economic planner, that means there are possibly hundreds of thousands or millions of workers who are not in that worker's workplace, who are in somebody else's workplace, but are getting a democratic say over the operations of your company when they haven't set foot in that place. They could be across the continent. You say it runs the problem.
So you said something earlier that I think in a roundabout way affects this. So right now what you're basically saying is like, well, let's say that 80% of the country votes that they need more widgets from your factory, but 0% of the widget factory workers vote that they want to make more widgets. What do you do, right? Well, democratically, the country wins. And what you end up with at the end of the day is just, it's always like, we've made markets, but we've just made them worse than what they were before. That's what it feels like. And you mentioned that earlier, where it feels like what you're basically doing is you're trying to reconstruct a market, but you're doing it in like basically just a less efficient way. So like, well, we'll figure out what goods and services to produce in society by having every single person vote on what they want to buy in society, even if people don't want to necessarily make it. And let's say somebody doesn't want to make it really badly. Maybe those people are allocated like a larger share of money. It's like, okay, so you're talking about like supply and demand, like a higher quantity would be demanded given like more compensation or something for it, or a higher quantity to be supplied and more. Like you're talking about like recreating markets just with more mechanisms to make it less efficient. Like, and that, it drives me crazy when I get these answers. It's like, why don't you use a fucking market then? I remember, like, I love him. He's a very polite guy, but that Michael Albert guy was talking about how, like, that was his thing with participatory economics. He was saying, like, okay, well, we can all vote on what to make, and if the factory workers really don't want to make it, then they would be compensated higher for this because we would vote to give them more money because they would vote that it would be harder and blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, you're basically talking about a market with, like, way more steps. Why?
I think it's because a lot of these ideas are coming from so far in the past that they're missing out on sort of how we've evolved in our economies and how we've evolved in our democracies. A lot of people, if you read what a lot of what Marx said outside of his manifesto, he's very anti-democratic. He sounds like a German nationalist at the time, who would have been like pro-Kaiser. And that's because he was writing this stuff back in the mid 1800s, before Europe even figured out how cool liberal democracy would be, before they figured out about how, you could use trade, and you could use you can use trade and just do different market regulations to allow people to, make decisions for themselves, but also contribute to the public good. And I think the problem is that these people are holding on to, they really want to hold on to their niche Ukrainian, anarchist economist philosopher from the 1930s, instead of just, you can still be a socialist and just make up your own socialism. I feel like the one argument I've always had with these people, and this is back when I was a socialist, because back when I was a commie, one of my main arguments was that, fine, let's all pool our money together. Let's go, go somewhere up in Maine, buy an old campground, and we just have a commune there. Let's test it out and see how it works. Or, if you think that the economy can literally be planned on a Dell laptop, then go get an economics degree or go get a comp sci degree and go do it. And you can literally make it trillions of dollars just planning out the economy for these different companies. Because if you could do it, every company would want it, because it would be so effective at market strategy. And you can literally just take that money and buy your own Caribbean island and just plop your own little socialist shithole on the island. It'll be great. You can have your utopia. It's like speed run. I don't know. It's a weird thing where I think it's because all of these people come from philosophy majors. So
no, that's not even true. They don't even know that. It's just people on the internet getting together forming clubs. I don't think there's any academic background whatsoever. I literally think it's just. I think
form a new club.
Yeah, I think people just get lonely. People need friends on the internet, and this is how they make them in political groups. It's kind of like the hip thing to do these days. Yeah.
So I don't know. I thought this when I was actually getting railed in DGG in the Discord. Someone was quoting Socrates at me. And I honestly believe that people just feel more smart and more authoritative the older the book they're able to quote at people. And I was like this in high school, because I'm a literary major. I felt very smart reading Dostoevsky and Camus and Dumas back in the 8th grade. And I think the feeling is there, that where you can quote this old manifesto from the 1800s, and it has the magical properties of evolving with capitalism while not changing anything. It sounds very cool when you quote it at people, because it's sort of because it allows you to complain about things while also sort of being outside of politics. You don't really need a solution for any of this, right? So you said you had 3 questions you always wanted to answer. What are the other 2?
4. So the first one was, how do we decide which businesses are allowed to exist in a socialist society without allowing capital investment? The second one was, this kind of is tied to the first. Is any form of investment whatsoever allowed in a socialist society? How do businesses raise additional capital for expansion? So let's say that I make a new restaurant, it's going well, and I want to make another one. I'm not allowed to raise money for that. Do I need to find 10 other workers that all want to join in that just happen to be unemployed? How do you expand your business, right? Because you're not allowed to hire labor or anything, right?
Right. So I'm loosely affiliated with the co-op right now, because I do copywriting, and they're looking at one of those in the future. And the way, at least under capitalism, the way that these people get investment is that you set a percentage of the company that is going to be laid out for the workers, the people who are working there. And it's going to be a maximum holding. So let's say 60%.
Yeah, sure.
But then you lay 40%, and you're allowed to sell those off to investors. And
so I've heard this before, that you have, so the idea is that the workers always have, but then there are a couple questions. So one, are those workers ever allowed to sell those shares on an open market, or do they have to find another worker? What if I want to quit? Or I guess maybe you could say that those shares just go back to the other pool of workers, as long as the workers themselves always hold 60% of the shares?
True. And then there's other problems where if you're getting new employees and you're basically dividing up the workers so much, while the capital owners, because those could be 1 or 2 investors.
One person could own 40% of the capital,
right.
And then 70,000 workers could own 60%. Well, guess what you've just created? You've created capitalism, where one guy is scraping money off of the profits of, right? And then another problem that I have with that is any business that necessarily is never going to have a controlling share done by a majority capital owners never has an obligation to those capital owners. Why the fuck would I ever invest in a business that will only allow 40% private investment? They're never going to have my shares in mind. They could do, or not my share, my
My interest.
My interest, yeah, Jesus. My interest in mind, right? They could do, like, they might vote tomorrow to distribute literally all of the money that the company currently has in Liquidate and just give it to, like, all the workers, and and then what, pay me back for my investment? I just make nothing? Like, that's just, like, such a shit system. Who would ever invest in a business like that? Like, why would you do that?
Right. And to be honest, the only real way, at least under capitalism, that you get these investments is you find some person with a lot of money who likes your pet project and wants to be a part of it.
Ironically,
so,
like a billionaire, a millionaire, yeah.
Well, yeah, ironic. Well,
yeah.
Sort of like, lefties all organize themselves around some famous Twitch streamer, and now the cops can all organize themselves around some famous philanthropist that wants to invest a few million into your company.
Yeah.
So there is a big problem with that. And I guess the other investments will come. Usually those do come from the government. This was a major problem in the Soviet Union, where the government there were very keen on investing into what they thought were strategically important facilities. So they put a lot of investment into heavy industry, steel manufacturing, machinery production. But they were in this weird sort of like Factoria cycle, like what you do, where you're just creating things so you can build more factories, create more things to build more factories. And like the Soviet Union was this industrial powerhouse, and nobody thought to like make teapots, right? So you had all of these poor babushkas running around with no teapots. Well, all of their sons were working in metallurgic factories.
I've heard this applied similarly to another problem where I read a very strange article about whaling in the Soviet Union and how they almost drove some species of animals to extinct. And the reason why was because so many of these quotas were just set as quotas, but they were very, very slow sometimes to adapt these things to the actual demands of the people. So you ended up with these wildly inefficient practices across their entire economy where they just weren't allocating their resources effectively because they were just doing it by arbitrary government quota.
Right, because they were this had to fit in with a strategic plan laid out by the Politburo, and the economy sort of moved on, surprisingly enough, even within months, and they just wouldn't know.
Yeah.
And this is also, in a weird way, this also really contributed to the destruction of the ROC, and like just thousands, the entire sea was toxified basically, outside of like Azerbaijan, which is doing a cleanup operation right now. They destroyed one of the largest seas and destroyed like hundreds of fishing villages. There was this actually huge sort of fishing economy based in the ROC, where all of these different fishing hamlets would trade with each other. And what happened was Soviet planners looked at that and saw that this was a sea that basically led to nowhere. There's this sort of ocean, and it got tributaries down from the mountains. And so they thought, like, well, this isn't really leading anywhere. So this is basically not really helping the workers out. Mm-hmm. They saw it as sort of, since it wasn't really adding to the industrialization of the Soviet Union, they saw it as unproductive capital. Decided that so even before they turned it into like this toxic wasteland, they went on these random projects where they tried to dam it up just because they thought that the sea shouldn't exist there anymore, and they thought it could be better spent elsewhere. The water could be better spent elsewhere. So there's a lot of this weird stuff where it's sort of like the issues you get with a lot of with healthcare is that if the government is paying for this, that means it's within the public interest to regulate this. And if literally everything is going to be doled out by investments from your state planners, mm-hmm. that means that means basically every aspect of production is now sort of within the interest of a couple of party bureaucrats. And that could lead to a lot of issues with natural resources. Just by like this being sort of part of the country's strategic value, and we've elected some people here who want to get production up and blah 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 blah. This is why almost every socialist state they've had really good heavy industries. They've been really good at manufacturing weapons. They've been awful at manufacturing commercial goods, to the point where even the wealthiest nations within the Com bloc, I think that was East Germany and Czechoslovakia, even these nations, the best of them, needed aid from, like in East Germany on Christmas time, they needed West German aid. Like West Germans would send care packages to East German children with chocolate in it, because the government was one of the wealthiest within what was the name for it? Wealthiest within the communist bloc.
The bloc, yeah.
And they couldn't even afford to make chocolate for kids on Christmas. There's a lot of stuff like that where it's just because to a planner, I mean, it must seem odd to allocate money that could be going to building tanks or building aircraft carriers or something to like a little mom and pop chocolate factory in some like bumfuck town somewhere on your periphery.
Sure.
And that is a major problem. Like, I'm sure that every one of these people who are talking about economic planning probably wouldn't think to set up a toe clipper factory. But those are pretty necessary, because if you lose one, you realize how much you needed it like about 2 weeks after you lose it.
Or it's hard to imagine any type of new industry, like especially risky ones that could fail. Like, it seems hard to imagine anything would get approved for state funding here when that money could go elsewhere, unless we're assuming we're going to have infinite money to assign, I guess.
Right. Well, even that, the problem with that is that even with the infinite money, you can't dole out as much as you want, because it still has to keep up with how much you can produce the money. So I'd assume that at some point, even if you're like MMT, at some point, like, well, we can only produce this X amount of dollars per month because this is literally all we can push out. And the majority of that could be going to all these really cool industries like transport and heavy industry and food production. So even if you're going in an MMT, it still probably would look weird to a central planner to start putting things into. I think you used the example of dildos with the debate in the past. It would probably, it would be really weird to have like your state planners look around and like on one side you could invest in you can invest in energy production, and on the other side there's a bunch of people who want to make children's toys sort of individually. But I mean, like, just as a strategist, if you literally have a socialist worldview where you have to be the strongest country on the planet, or literally just have a world revolution, otherwise the capitalists are going to destroy you, where do you think the investment is going to be made? It's probably not going to be made into the children toys.
Yeah.
So you said 4. So what's the third one?
1, 2, 3 is, how are labor markets determined in a socialist society? I always hear people say that you can explore whatever you want and nobody's going to be forced to work any job. And now that we're not going to have like market structure set up to force people to work, which is kind of what you have to do in a capitalist society. If in a socialist society, everyone can choose whatever they want or whatever, what are you going to do if there are, this doesn't really apply to the market socialists. This applies to the more traditional socialists, like where the means and modes of production have been changed. Because a market socialist say, oh, well, there are still wages and shit, so you would choose your job. I guess I don't know how wages would go up. That would be a more complicated question. But yeah, I'm curious.
Some of them don't even believe in circulating currency. They still think that even if you're forming a co-op, that you should be paid based on like government bonds.
Yeah, but so then my question is like, what do you do when you need like a company that doesn't have the correct number of workers, right, in your society? Because in a capitalist market, the wages would increase and increase and increase, and the compensation would hopefully incentivize somebody to work in that job. But in a socialist society, does that just not happen? Do you just get fucked out of, if you don't have any nuclear engineers, are you just fucked? Do you just pray and hope that enough people fill out the right jobs? That's the third one. And then the fourth one is just the calculation problem. How can we calculate which goods and services a nation needs if we do away with the commodity form? So this wouldn't work with market socialists because they still believe in the commodity form. But for people that advocate for the abolition of the commodity form, how do you figure out which goods and services need to be produced? I've never heard a socialist give an adequate answer to any of these 4 questions ever. But I normally just kind of let them slide on it. I don't push them on it, but I'll really lean into this one. Based on what I've seen of Wolff, I don't think he's going to provide anything satisfactory to any of these. And then for like people like Brunig and Medlock, all of these quote unquote socialist guys on the internet just seem to be like liberals with like big safety nets. So
it seems like most of these people just want capitalism, but you're guaranteed not to have homeless people.
Exactly. Yeah. Which sounds great, which I'm in favor of, but that's liberalism.
Something we could do.
Yeah,
right.
It's just to do with socialism.
Yeah. There's this happy space between liberalism and social democracy called social liberalism. And it's basically been the progressive economic policy of Scandinavia for the past 20 years, or since wherever they had their social democratic countries come up.
The majority of like Europe's, so like left parties are this. I get so irritated when especially Americans seem to think that like there are so many socialists across all of Europe, but the parties are all liberal. They're all liberal parties, even if they have socialists in the name. Like the vast majority of these like parties, I don't know of any country that has any huge socialist representation in Europe that I've looked into, or maybe there are some in Eastern Europe that I don't know.
think. Oh no, there aren't any in Eastern. First off, in Romania, you'd probably get shot for being a communist. Mostly, I mean most of them had to have a revolution against a totalitarian socialist state, so they don't really have popular left-leaning parties. I guess like there are a few examples, like Portugal, I think, has a large actual socialist party.
So like the last time I looked this up, the biggest one I saw was in Spain. because they literally call themselves like the Socialist Workers' Party. But this is like a party that's been criticized in the past for like performing austerity measures and shit. Like these guys
for Portugal, these guys are like they've aligned themselves foreign policy wise with China.
Sure.
Like they're blocking EU votes to stop China from buying up strategic assets and stuff like that as socialist allies. So they are commies, but they're not the fun ones that all of the American lefties seem to like. With all of their sort of modern liberal sensibilities, they're the ones that really like China to sort of start taking over Western Europe. And I think Greece had some. I'm not sure about Greece. I think they did because Greece came out of a failed fascist dictatorship, and usually that means you're going to have some more popular left-leaning parties. And I think they had an actual communist party now, but it's very small. It got overtaken. Even when they do have sort of actual socialist parties, they usually get overtaken by social democrats really quickly. There's this sort of weird irony where if you look at all of these, almost every, like if you look at Spain, if you look at all of Europe, even in Germany, if you look at all these places where either someone has become a communist dictatorship or a fascist dictatorship, usually what's happened there is you have this majority social democrat support or sort of liberal support from the population. And then you have this either communist on one side and the fascists on the other side, which are both very anti-democracy, which really want a dictatorship, but for their side. I think currently Denmark is a good example of this, where in Denmark, there are only two political parties which openly advocate for the abolition of democracy. One of them are basically they're this fascist party. They're the children of a bunch of Nazi collaborators. And the other one is the Communist Party, which wants a dictatorship of the workers and wants to kick out all the other parties for parliament because they don't really have support from the people. And it's sort of like history is all of this. Like Spain could have been a republic, which would have been nice for World War II. But the Soviets killed all of the Republicans in the left-leaning movement when they were in the Civil War, and the anarchists decided to split their movement off from the Republican movement and have a second sort of mini Civil War with them. That's where we get the weird anarchist Catalonia. Actually, a lot of people talk about it glowingly, but those people literally stabbed the Republican movement in the back, and you could say that they led to the fascist takeover of Spain, because after that, the Republicans just had to throw in the towel and sort of cede power to the authoritarians on the right side. It's sad like that. The calculation stuff. The answer, I think for Pogan, he's going to give you this one study where an econ major and a poli-sci major say that they figured out how to plan the economy with an algorithm.
Using computer shit? Yeah, fuck that shit.
Yeah. None of this has been like. I was always really interested in this because I used to be a socialist and I wanted to know this shit because that sounded tasty as fuck for me because I could throw that at people. So in an ironic twist, I was a socialist and a communist in high school. And then when I got to university, I had enough time to do the research. I was like, oh shit, good thing I wasn't so active on social media back then because all of this is unimaginably stupid. So the argument from them usually is that this can be you could plan this out with an algorithm, or I think people will go back to Cybersyn from Chile, which is an old example. I think that's from the 70s. That was a little bit before Pinochet took power. And at least for the Cybersyn, there was some success with planning distribution, but still, even then, they couldn't plan need. They were just planning more efficient ways to distribute products after the market has actually already decided need. And for the other stuff, there's just never actually been signed. This has never been borne out. The Pogan ran away because the argument you should use for him is that if this is true, why aren't there so many capitalists trying to invest in these programs so they can use it to make more money in capitalism? And if it's really true, then why are there only ever like a couple of studies that exist that are from a couple of niche people which don't do much publishing and who've never really gone through peer review?
So this is usually when I ask about things like co-ops or whatever, like people will start to say like, oh, co-ops like massively outperform capital, or co-ops are actually way better, they make more money, they're more efficient, blah, blah, blah. Because usually my question is, well, why the fuck aren't there so many more co-ops forming? But usually I just get some vague allusion to like conspiratorial thought from like, oh, well, it's because banks don't loan money to co-ops, or capitalists try to suppress all the co-ops, or like shit like that. It's usually the things that I hear.
Yeah. And I think this is born out of people sort of needing a way to defend the label, but not really being interested in how they do it. And I think, I'm going to say this, I think you've partially contributed to this culture, because I think a lot of people looked at you as this sort of detached logic bro. And now you have a bunch of people who are just looking to win a debate, and they have a label, but they don't exactly know what the label means. And winning an argument with a lot of people, sometimes having very different contradictory opinions depending on what you're arguing about. So I'll use Vosh as an example, because I used to be a Vosh fan. One of his main arguments used to be that co-ops are good, because this is back when he was a full commie, but he only argued for co-ops because that's the easy thing to defend.
Yeah, the Mountain Bailey, yeah.
Yeah. So his argument would always be that democracy is inherently good, almost on like a deontological thing. I think you could, if you trapped most of these people and forced them to answer, they would just in some way tell you that they just think socialism is an inherent moral good, and then that's why everything.
I don't think you have to trap. I think most people will just come out and say like capitalism is like inherently evil and blah blah blah.
Well, they'll say capitalism inherently evil. I think these people believe that there's some sort of moral compulsion to just be a socialist no matter what.
Well, I mean,
whether
it's
or not you're
the
an
extension of like, if you're not a capitalist, you should be something else that's more moral, and they'd say socialism is more moral.
Yeah, sure, I guess. But the argument he always made is, democracy is inherently good. Now, we talked about earlier about how communism, like sort of these centrally planned, more sort of like socialistic economies, aren't really conducive to actual having a democratic say over your workplace. It's you're just voting for the government, and the government's giving you economic policy. Sometimes you don't even get to vote for the government. But then all of a sudden, I heard in this conversation, you had another debate with the same guy. And you got to the problem of, well, what happens when the workers don't vote for things you want them to? And his answer was, fuck democracy. He like got up. It was very funny. This guy was whinging for 40 minutes about how he wanted true democracy for the workers. And when a guy posed him a theoretical question of what if there was a co-op that did research in medicine, and they didn't, and let's say they wanted to keep the IP for this medicine so they could get money for their work. And he jumped up and he shouted, "Fuck the workers!" Then, because we have to do what's good for society. And I think there are a lot of people who have I think Xander Hall is another one of these people. Most lefties now, it's weird where they don't really have these coherent they don't have a coherent sort of idea of what system they're advocating for, but they have the label, and they saw that it looks really good to always be smashing on some guy in an argument in a debate. So I don't know. I think in 5 years, all of these people are going to be like Tulsi Gabbard Sims. They're all going to be like semi-fascists. So I think they're going to evolve out of this really quickly.
I feel like a lot of the super left online shit is going to move on to the next. I don't know if it'll be fascism, because I think that shit kind of came and went. It'll be whatever the next political fad is. Like 3 or 4 years ago, it was kind of the anti-SJW skeptic shit. Now, like the new fad is like the weird, like cringy socialist shit. And then in a few years, it's probably going to be some, I don't know, anarchists, or I'm not even going to pretend.
I mean, anarchists sort of came and went. Who knows? The weird argument for anarchism is it's sort of like they want to go back to feudalism. There's another thing for socialists. When eventually people, when they finally get to that utopia, there's a big issue where if you don't have currency and you don't have a government, how do people trade with each other, and how do people sort of give each other stuff? And it almost comes down to them sort of trying to describe bartering in the nicest way possible. There's this weird competition. All right, so there's no money. We're not trading stuff. We're just giving each other stuff to help each other out, and it's based off of our needs and interests. So it seems like a lot of them are just sort of trying to bring us back to pre-capitalism days, which is weird. Another argument, I guess, is one thing I would harp on with the Richard Wolff stuff when he doesn't answer is that if you want to snap your fingers and make this broad systemic change, that you should have all of this stuff planned out, because you can't really oscillate between a capitalistic or progressive society versus a communistic one. Because you've changed everything at that point. You can't go back and forth. And there's something to be said about the history of capitalism, where you had all of these experimental movements over time. I know this is a weird thing where people think there's like this capitalist revolution that brought down the nobility, and then we had the revolution for capitalism. We didn't know what would happen when we did that revolution, but we thought it would be better, and now we're just going to do the socialist one. I think you've gotten that a lot. But there's something to be said that for capitalism, there was like hundreds of years of experimentation. Like the Hanseatic League was operating in the 1300s. And that was just a couple of dudes on the Baltic coast, which are like, whoa, what if we did investment and trade and see what happens? And you could go to the Renaissance in Italy, or or you could say that there was even some really weird experimentations with capitalism in Latin America before the settlers, before the conquistadors went down there, because they were working with currency, and with currency and with markets in a very sort of small way. Yeah, so there's stuff like that. There's I don't want to get so much into the historical stuff. I think you mentioned the Katyn massacre. And,
I don't know. I might have, but I don't know anything about it. I don't think I mentioned it. Or if I did, somebody else brought it up, but there's some...
Yeah, you mentioned in your conversation with Kraut or something, you mentioned the Katyn massacre.
Okay.
This straddles one thing, because on one hand, it's actually a really good argument to make against Holocaust deniers if you ever wind up debating those guys in the future. But a lot of people know this, but the Katyn massacre was just sort of one thing that was connected to this big campaign of genocide from the Soviet Union. In a weird way, the Soviet Union is also almost a mirror of Nazi Germany in the invasion of Poland. Both sides invaded Poland. They wanted to partition it off to basically get buffer zones between them and the other side. And both of them used the invasion of Poland as a start point for their campaigns of ethnic cleansing. The Soviets started with the Polish operation. And they did other stuff, but this is the main one this is going to be one of the new sort of ethnic cleansing campaigns of them. Where, at least in the Soviet Union proper, they tried and tortured and executed over 120,000 ethnic Poles. The NKV did this. And then once they invaded Poland, they sort of moved into the different Eastern European countries as they were sort of fighting over them with the Nazis. And they started doing the ethnic cleansing there as well. I think you mentioned in the past that you didn't think at least the Soviet Union was very nationalistic, but I think that's not very true. They, in certain circumstances, they almost viewed themselves as sort of like how the Japanese viewed themselves in Asia. Like the Japanese thought that they were, we are the most industrialized, we have the best politics and the best system, so we almost have a moral duty to civilize the rest of our brethren so we can fight the Westerners. And the Soviet Union saw itself as Russians were obviously the best and most noble people because they had the communist revolution first. So now it's their job to spread it to the rest of the Baltic and the Eastern European and the Balkan states. There's a lot of weird stuff like that. There's one thing I really wanted. This is from the Buddhism guy. This is really pissed me off because I'm a Buddhist, and I don't think he understood anything of what he was saying.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah. So and clearly, anytime a white guy starts a sentence with "as a Buddhist," you're going to hear some crazy shit, right? Because most of the time, it's an aesthetics thing for them.
Sure. And
I think it is for him because it is on a few different levels, because the Nichiren Buddhist branch that he's a part of, these people are known for disregarding all of the sutras. The sutras are these philosophical texts by previous Buddhist scholars. And I'm a Zen Buddhist, and in Zen we don't really follow the sutras so much. We have the koans, unless you're Soto like me, and we focus more on meditation. But the Nichiren are special in that they actually believe in eternal damnation, and they believe that anybody who preaches any sutra other than the Lotus Sutra will go to hell for basically misleading the people away from enlightenment. So it was really weird that he started to say a bunch of weird stuff about like, well, there's no such thing as an individual. We're all actually spiritually just one single person, stuff like that. And he started quoting these very esoteric niche sutras that most people don't read into. As a person who he himself should believe, you're not allowed to read those sutras. Like, I don't understand why people do this with religion. The same way as they do with socialism, they find the niche sort of really aesthetically cool thing, and then you start blabbing about it. Yeah. In fairness, he's probably only a Nichiren because they used to be a really militant terrorist sect in Japan. And so the way they set up their temples was, instead of having like a monastery or a centralized monastic order that people would go to, they would democratically set up these underground temples, because these people were literally trying to train as guerrilla fighters so they could overthrow the emperor and have a religious civil war. But I think you probably just saw it's formed democratically, so it's cool. That's like socialism, and socialism is formed democratically, so I should be a Nichiren. There's a lot of weird stuff like that. As a viewer, there's all of the people in the YouTube chat can attest to this. We hear a lot of dumb stuff and we scream at our phones, but we never get to say anything. So this is fun.
Probably do more research, especially after a couple of my debates before Richard Wolff, just because I'll be hearing new things. So.
Yeah, I'll be listening to you.
Remember to hit that like and subscribe, and don't forget the notification bell so that my videos show up right in your feed.
Oh my God, this little girl that this guy has, I'm gonna bust.